I'd like to talk to you about a method that I've been developing, which I call directional acoustic monitoring. I'd like to tell you what it is and show you a few results that I've got. I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Morton, who also works with me at Aarhus University. He's the baticologist. I'm a beginner baticologist with a physics background. I would also like to acknowledge Exeter University, because this is where I really started doing this seriously, and they hold the intellectual property for this. So, but I'm now at Aarhus. So, first off, what do I mean by directional acoustic monitoring? And to start with, I'm just going to tell you what it isn't. It should just put it into context, because some of you, or most of you, are probably aware of this method and might have used it. So it sort of puts it in context that you use an array of microphones spaced around the site, and if there's a sound near the microphones, there's different distance to each microphone, so they all arrive at different times. You do a little bit of a calculation and you can tell where the position of the, for example, bat was. So this is an existing method. It's been around for a long time. It's certainly been around since, I think, the First World War, where they used it to find gun emplacements, for example. Yeah, it's a good method. It works. I'm not here to criticize it, but it's not widely adopted. And I think that one of the reasons for that is it's a bit cumbersome. So you need a multi-channel recorder, the channels need to be synchronized in time, you need multiple microphones to place them all around the survey site, so that means lots of microphones, lots of measuring, lots of cables. It's harder to get elevated positions, so for flying species it's not quite so useful, because the hyperbole intersect at shallower angles when things are up in the air. Also, very often you need offline processing afterwards with your recordings to actually get the numbers out. Now, I'm not criticizing the people who do this at all. In fact, completely the opposite. I think it's great, and I think more people should be doing it, and that's the point of this. I think this sort of spatial tracking from sounds is really good, and my aim is to try and make it accessible to more people. So can we do this better? We're used to using static recorders. This is pretty routine. We put something out in the field, we record sound for a couple of weeks, and then go back and look at the recordings. And so that gives us presence of a particular species within its detection range of a microphone. If we could do some sort of spatial tracking, I think, as a routine, then we get better science, better monitoring. So that's my aim. So let me tell you now what actually it is. I've tried to avoid technical and physics terms here, but the very simple principle is that if you have two microphones spaced very close together, perhaps 4 millimeters, if you've got a bat that's directly above you, then the path length is exactly the same to the two microphones. If the bat was to one side, the path length would be very slightly different, and you'd get a phase shift between the two microphones. So the big difference here is that with time difference of arrival, you're spacing the microphones out by several meters. Here you're spacing the microphones by 3 or 4 millimeters. So what we're doing is not measuring position, we're measuring angle. So we're measuring that angle from vertical to one side. Another way of looking at the difference is if we look at the actual recordings that we make. With time difference of arrival, we have, for example, 2 back calls recorded at 2 different microphones. You'd need more microphones to do it, but I'm just going to show it with 2. There's a time delay between them, and you measure the time delay. With this method, which is essentially a simple interferometer, if you looked at the recordings in the context and the time resolution on the left, they'd arrive at exactly the same time. You wouldn't be able to see the difference because the microphones are so close together. But if you zoom in on the time axis, you see a little phase shift. So from that phase shift, we can determine the angle. Now, we need a method of determining that phase shift. If all animal species would cooperate and just emit nice simple sine waves. That would be very trivial, but bat calls, for example, are heavily modulated in amplitude and frequency, and it's quite a hard problem, but we've worked out a method to do that. We can do it, so it makes this method possible. So that's one dimension. We could extend this to 2 dimensions. And all you do is you do exactly the same thing, rotated round at 90 degrees. So you have 2 microphones pointing that way, you get one axis, 2 microphones pointing that way, you get another axis. And in fact, you can share a microphone, so you can have a common reference microphone. And what this gives you is a direction towards the bat. In mathematical terms, it's a unit vector, so we know the direction, we don't know the length. We don't know how far away the bat is, or whatever animal, bird, but we know the direction. So the picture on the left is actually a prototype of this type of 2-dimensional interferometer. Now this was made by Elekon, who make bat loggers. If you'd like to see one, they've got one downstairs in the foyer, so I'd encourage you to go and have a look at it. So that gives you the direction towards the bat. Now, what about if you want to get an absolute position in space? Well, you can operate it in what I call Ghostbusters mode. So you have 2 of these interferometers, you cross the beams. Where those beams intersect is the unique position in space where the bat is. Now, something that's quite good about this is that we don't really need any accurate timing between these 2 interferometers. All we have to do is uniquely identify each call, because they're essentially independent systems. We just get that angle and do a bit of geometry, find out where the bat is. So that's essentially how it works. So what I'd like to do now is just to show you a few examples. So this is the experimental setup. This is in Denmark. It's a river just south of Aarhus. All the equipment here is supplied by Elekon, and we have, I was trying to do Ghostbusters mode, but unfortunately one of the channels wasn't working. So we just had it in single direction mode, and that's where it is, just south of Aarhus in Denmark. I didn't have a very good mount. If you go and look at Elekon's mount, it's a little bit neater than my beer crate and woodwork clamp, but with a spirit level and a compass, I managed to get quite a good alignment. It is a prototype, it's getting better. So let's have a look at some examples. So here we go, Nathusius Pipistrelle. I think I've got my species ID right on this. Morton couldn't actually get the recordings into the software that he uses for ID, but he looked at my slides, he thought I was about right. But if I've got any of them wrong, please feel free to correct me. So this, I think, is a Nathusius Pipistrelle, and if we have a look at the data, so essentially what this is we're seeing the bat flying across the sky. On the left, the only difference between the left and the right is that I've connected the dots up. And I've numbered each dot in sequence, and each dot represents a call in the recording. Now, it's off at an angle pointing up to the top left. The reason for this is that on the survey site, there was a cutting into the river for boats, and that's where I put the microphones. So that is actually corresponding. That bat was flying straight down the river. So that's a track of it flying across the sky. This is a nocturnal. It's a big recording, lots and lots of calls there. Very, very complex. I haven't tried to really understand that, but you can see some structure there, different areas where it's perhaps foraging, whatever it's doing. There's probably more than one in the air at the same time as well. A Serotine, again, we've just got that flight straight down the river. But if you have a look sort of near the centre, there's some that are off that flight path. And the plot on the left is very good for identifying this sort of thing, because you can see it doesn't connect up. So they aren't just points that haven't been measured accurately. I think the reason for those other points, there's another bat in the sky at the same time. This was at Daubenton's. It might have been a pond bat. Don't really know. We have those in Denmark. And the interesting thing about this is it was foraging over the water. So we have it just in one horizontal plane. So that was quite a good result. This, if you look at the start of it, we've got a Soprano Pipistrelle and then the Myotis type call. And you can see that we've got a Pipistrelle flying around and then the Daubenton on the river. I thought this was a Myotis as well, but it's not horizontal on the river. So it was either a Daubenton flying around before it started foraging over the water, or it was a different Myotis species, I don't know. And finally, we have, this is my favourite, we've got a Soprano Pipistrelle and there's a feeding buzz in the middle of it. When we look at the data, first thing that we notice is it's not one Soprano Pipistrelle. There's a Soprano Pipistrelle flying along the river, but at the same time there's another one crossing the river at right angles to it. So we can really, I don't think you could tell, maybe you could, I don't know, that that's two in the air at the same time. But from here, it's very, very obvious. I circled all of the calls that were inside that feeding buzz, and they're all inside that little green circle. And if we zoom in, you can see the flight path of the Pipistrelle catching whatever it was catching. So it's done a little loop, and then it's carried on its way. So I don't know whether anybody's done that before, but I really like that. So that's all the data. I made 169 recordings that night. There were one or two where there was no data. I managed to get angles from, I think, every single call in all of those recordings, apart from a few where it was very saturated, so the call was too loud and it clipped. Some of the clipping has still got good positions, but if it clips a lot, but I'd say 99% of the calls that I looked at, I got good direction data for. So, and this is with different species. I should also say that I've tried this with birds as well, and the same algorithm works with 12 different bird species just as well as it works with bat species. So, just quickly have a look at applications. I think it's best for looking at very high resolution things such as infrastructure. So, roads, bridges, tunnels, gantries, that sort of thing, wind turbines, street lighting. Also, perhaps if you want to look at flight paths, for example, down a hedgerow, if you want to know which direction something is flying in, then just a single interferometer will be able to tell you that. Perhaps not so good for the really big landscape scale stuff. I think what you want for that is lots and lots of really cheap detectors, so audio moth. If you want to know directions along hedgerows, then of course, yeah, but it's really for this fine resolution detail that I think this is its application. Might have applications with commercial consultancy. I did do this for a couple of years. I worked for a consultancy in Devon over the summer for a couple of years, just as the person who stands there with a clipboard, because I felt a bit of a fraud. I'd invented probably the most sophisticated bat detector that anybody had ever created, and I'd never even used a handheld bat recorder before, bat detector before, so I went to learn how to do it. And I know what it's like trying to spot a black bat coming out of a dark roof with a black sky behind it in the night. I don't think this is going to get rid of the consultants with the clipboard, but I think you'd get better data. And certainly for activity surveys, I think you'd really start to understand how a site was used. So you could track the movements of the bats over the survey area. You could see which landscape features they were perhaps using for navigation, where they're using the site for foraging. So you could, again, you could write a better survey. So if you want to do this yourself, there is a commercial product coming out. I've been working with the guys at Elekon to try and commercialize this. And you can, I know very little about the product. If you want to know about the product, talk to the Elekon guys on the stand. If you want to talk about the idea behind it, I'm happy to talk with you. I think the important thing to say here is that we're going to do the calculations on the device. The point of this is really, really easy. You take the device out, you put a couple of interferometric microphones down, you switch it on, and it spits out angles. So it's ease of access, I think, is the key to it. Next steps, I showed this slide a month ago at the steering group meeting, and I've managed to tick one of them off, which is record species. But I really think that the next thing to do with this is nobody really knows how to use this technology, what the best practices are, and that includes me. I went to do a recording at a neighbour's house. He has 300 Soprano Pipistrelles in an outbuilding, and I was setting up. He was asking me about it, so he said, "How far apart do you have these?" And I don't know, I've never done this before. Nobody has. So somebody really needs to write the manual of how to do this, to turn it into a practical field method. I also want to do science with it. Also, it's been unfunded so far, so to move on to the next step, I think I really need to get some cash so I can do this as my day job rather than my hobby. And that's it.